Before I start this video, let me just remind you that I have a new account for all of my anime content and I started up my own comedy channel. With that being said, let's get back to the video. The Philippines, known for its tropical climate and beaches. It's probably also where most of your internet friends live, but it's not known for its firearms industry. How could this have changed? Well, for those of you that don't know, firearms and gunpowder were invented by the Chinese in the 9th century, but Filipino civilizations were small and insignificant back then, so we'll begin this timeline in the 11th century. Some Chinese merchants would sell firearms to the Filipinos. At the time, there were 4 states located in the Philippine archipelago that weren't so small that even with firearms they wouldn't last. First, there was the Igorot society, which was landlocked. So, for the Chinese to sell firearms to them, they would have to travel through either the last of these civilizations in the Philippines I will mention, or travel through the wilderness. Another was the Rajanate of Cebu, which was very primitive. So, even if they did buy firearms from the Chinese, they wouldn't have learnt to manufacture their own. Then the Huangdom of Mai. And last but not least, there was the Kingdom of Tondo. The peoples of Mai and Tondo would have likely learned how to manufacture their own firearms by the year 1400. However, they wouldn't be able to make their own gunpowder, as these Filipino states lacked the sophisticated chemistry required to reverse engineer gunpowder. But the Kingdom of Tondo would be able to buy a game-changing amount of gunpowder since it was wealthy, so it would go on to conquer more of the Philippine archipelago, but hardly any more than it did in our timeline, since firearms were pretty useless in the 12th century. Back then, a firearm would only serve as a to startle the opposing army. However, as time would go by, the firearms would be more helpful, especially when Madhaas is established in the 13th century, then goes on to become the biggest enemy of Tondo. And since the Madha Confederacy used to attack Chinese ships and raid the southern coastal parts of China, the Chinese would teach the people of Tondo how to make their own gunpowder to decrease Madha's piracy. I can't say when for sure, but Tondo would have eventually defeated Madha. I haven't talked much about Mai, since it would become geopolitically irrelevant just like it did in our timeline after Tondo secured a monopoly on trade with China in the archipelago. Moving on to around 1400, in our timeline, the Bruneian Empire defeated the Kingdom of Tondo and made it into a puppet state. I can't say whether they'd do this or not in this timeline, but even if Tondo both defeats Madha and repels the Bruneian Empire, it won't be peaceful. It didn't have the social infrastructure to keep the firearms in the hands of its fighting forces, which means that a rebellious barangay could ignite a coup or civil war. Whatever the case, this will be a violent region of the world. This means that by the time the Spanish arrive, the people of the Philippines will have had a lot of experience improving the designs of their firearms and experience fighting other armies that use firearms and come up with better tactics and strategies to fight other armies that use firearms. You may think this would mean that the Spanish would fail to conquer the Philippines. However, they could just throw gold and silver that they extracted from the New World into more and bigger armies until the Philippines succumbed. You may think this means that Spain would have colonized less of the Philippines in the same time. However, the Philippines is so important, being Spain's only colony in Asia, and Asian goods were worth a fortune in Europe, and spice was the whole reason for the expedition. The Philippines was also the crux of Spanish trade between Asia and the New World, where goods could be transported through Mexico to Europe. They would do whatever it would take to conquer it at the same speed they did in real life. This would mean they'd negotiate more with the Filipinos, granting them more rights and autonomy. When the Spanish would conquer an area during this period in history after they would defeat the opposing armies, they would agree to recognize their hierarchies, and the Spanish would keep all the spoils of war, including a lot of stolen land, the Spanish being at the top of this hierarchy, Spanish intermarrying with those previously at the top of the hierarchy and using the hierarchy to be even more oppressive to the masses than it previously was, with varying degrees depending on how well the natives defended themselves. This led to the encomiendas. All this means that the Spanish Empire would have a smaller grip on power in the Philippines and would have less institutions designed to extract as as much as possible for the benefits of the Spanish, which will later butterfly into their not being as much of a tiny minority exploiting the rest of the country when it gains independence. During the 7 Years' War, the British invasion would likely be repelled considering they only seized Manila in our timeline, and since the Filipinos have more rights and autonomy in this timeline, more would be willing to fight for Spain and would be better armed. Now, most of the countries in Spanish America gained independence after Napoleon conquered Spain because the Bayonne Statute, which the Bonapartes imposed on the Spanish Empire, restricted the power of the ruling Spanish and the church. The poor and indigenous revolted because the church was the only institution that protected them, and opportunistic, wealthy white Latin Americans saw the opportunity to use these indigenous and to a lesser extent mixed race people to seize power for themselves. I think that when Napoleon takes over Spain, there's likely to be more rebellions in the Philippines due to opportunistic but stupid generals in the Philippines using the fact that far more Filipinos can manufacture their own firearms than did in our timeline, rather than their only means of getting them being from smugglers or foreign powers, paired with the fact that there were areas the Spanish struggled with and some they never really controlled after conquest. Means those regions can gain independence, but not the whole Philippines. The Philippines as a whole is less likely to gain independence at this time since the Latin American wars for independence were led by politically conscious and active rich white Latin Americans. The Philippines, by contrast, had a much smaller presence of Españoles Filipinos and very little national consciousness at that stage. In this timeline, since the Filipinos had more negotiating power, there would have been less opportunities to exploit the Philippines for their own benefit, which would mean there would have been less incentives for rich Spanish people to move there. What is definite, though, is that if they don't gain independence at this time, they would do it when Joseph Bonaparte is booted off the Spanish throne. The old Spanish order would have been restored after the Filipinos had a taste of liberty, equality, and fraternity. When the Philippines gains independence, it will emerge from the War of Independence battered, and Maguindanao, which was a country bordering the Spanish East Indies that Spain was conquering during this period, would take advantage of this and reconquer some of its lost territory. The Philippines would realize that Maguindanao has geography on its side and look to how the British put down Wolfe Tone's rebellion in Ireland and see that the British managed to do it, despite Ireland having geography on their side since Britain was industrializing and Ireland wasn't. The Philippines would realize that they need to industrialize in order to survive in this dog-eat-dog world, since they had just gained independence and they already lost some islands. And on top of that, the biggest sector of their economy at the time would likely be rubber, and rubber is easy to work with. Rubber processing would be an industry in itself. And since the Philippines is an archipelago, they would need an industrialized navy to survive in an industrializing world. At first, I think the only parts of the Philippines to industrialize would be the temperate parts, since they can't grow cash crops, and only a small parts could industrialize immediately, since during its period as a Spanish colony, only 1/3 of Filipinos were literate in Spanish. Wealthy Filipinos would send their children to be educated in Europe. After this War of Independence, it would make allies with Thailand, since Thailand would be the least likely country in the Philippines neighborhood to try and seek expansion into the Philippines. And when it recovers from the War of Independence, it will seize Guam from Spain, since once the Philippines recovers, Spain would still be in shambles. And since Spain administered Guam from the Philippines, the Filipinos would see it as their right to seize it along with Spain's other colonies in the Pacific. They would also forge strong relations with Hispanic countries in the Americas due to a common struggle against Spanish colonialism. And then everything from here on out becomes unpredictable. I mean, the British occupation of Manila alone involved thousands of people, not just the soldiers and sailors involved, but people bringing them food, weapons, and other supplies at home and probably in India, which was almost certainly the location that supplied the forces. There would be decision makers and civil servants planning things and a lot of actions resulting. The British will be encountering different people and a different environment. Considering far more Brits would have died in this botched invasion, people who had a part to play in our world would have never been born. Ditto for many Filipinos, and the reverse for many of them. The Brits who survive would be going back home, or back to India would be very different different people, giving very different advice to those they knew. People who in our timeline were stationed in the Spanish East Indies, whether as missionaries, merchants, soldiers, civil servants, etc., will also have had drastically different experiences, especially since a much larger proportion of them would have dealt with the kingdom of Tondo and whatever offshoots it would have had, which will have an avalanche effect in terms of how their lives develop, who they meet, including probably who and when they marry, so things would flow from all that. For Spain, this means changes going all the way back to when Magellan first arrived in Cebu. For China, it means little changes outside of those among its merchant population who were born in or worked in its southern regions. But slowly as time goes by, most of the subjects of the Ming dynasty would be different people by the time the Qing dynasty starts their conquest of it. Going back to the beginning, since what I already said had already made quite a few of Spain's non-royalty different people from who they were in our timeline, by the time Spain recovers from the Anglo-Spanish War of 1779 to 83, its royalty would have been completely different people from those of our timeline, even if their DNA is almost identical. For the rest of continental Western Europe, it would be somewhere around the late 1790s to mid-1850s. The UK's and Eastern Europe's would be any time in the middle half of the 19th century, but because the butterflies in France would have only just made the French royalty different, I doubt they could have prevented the French Revolution, which is why it still happens. And the only reason why Napoleon, as we know him in our timeline, is still around is because Corsica's geographical position makes it isolated until France takes it over within roughly a decade of when it did in our timeline, which wouldn't be such a big impact on Mr. Bonaparte. I mean, George Washington is likely still born, and the American War of Independence would resemble that of our timeline, but the borders of the country after gaining independence could be moderately different, and the early voter populations would differ quite a lot. I don't know if Andrew Jackson would be born, or if he was, would he lose the 7th presidency to someone else? Would the 7th president of the United States in this timeline still commit the Trail of Tears? Manifest Destiny could have been extremely different, possibly ending before reaching Cape Mendocino, when Texas would join the Union, all of which would have massive butterflies. None of these extremely relevant people in world history from the past 200 to 300 years likely would have been born. But here's what's certain. Since the Philippines would have industrialized quite a bit by the mid-19th century, which would be before Japan had even started, and in our timeline Japan was the model on which East and Southeast Asia tried to industrialize, expect other Asian countries to modernize differently in this timeline. Then again, Japan wasn't modernizing since it closed itself off to the rest of the world until it was forced open by the United States in 1853, so Japan might be forced to open up earlier considering the butterflies. Another thing we can be sure of is that if Tondo successfully repels the Bruneian Empire, since the Philippine War of Independence was a bottom-up one and not a top-down one like those in Hispanic America were, and since the Spanish Empire only had a light touch on a Tondese civilization in this timeline compared to what it was in our timeline, when it gains independence, Tondo's weird hierarchical form of quasi-democracy might be restored in the Philippines. In this system, a group of 100 and more families would be stratified together and called a barangay. But considering monogamy, parenthood, and nuclear residence, aka familia, was introduced by the Spanish with varying degrees of success, which most probably included outlawing cousin marriages, the barangay unit would likely be replaced by a group of settlements stratified together, of which the total populations are similar. Maybe these would be constituencies. Anyway, each barangay was led by a datu. Several datus were led by a lakan, who were democratically selected by the datus of each barangay, or a similar system could be put in place, perhaps just one that replaces barangays with constituencies, or an even more oppressive hierarchy similar to what Spain would have put in place. And if representative or direct democracies are popular in this timeline like they are in our timeline, then the Philippine government would slowly transition into a direct or representative democracy. But in a scenario where the equivalent of the Axis winning World War II or Soviets winning the Cold War happen, and dictatorships are popular, then the government would probably slide into something like an absolute monarchy with socialistic or nationalistic tendencies depending on the scenario. It might even go the route of a constitutional monarchy. But if the Bruneian Empire defeats Tondo in this timeline like it did in our timeline, then the Philippines would likely be a larger Catholic version version of Malaysia. Another way it would be like a Catholic Malaysia is that in our timeline, the Philippines is a secular state due to decades of American influence. But since in this timeline it never would have been an American Commonwealth, it would likely be a religious state like Malaysia, but its religious minorities would make up a larger proportion of its population, like Malaysia. But in any scenario, the Philippines would be somewhere in between 2 of the 5 wealthiest former Spanish colonies in the Americas, Argentina being the worst case scenario, since even though in 2019 it had a higher GDP per capita per purchasing power parity than Costa Rica, its economy has never really been on a trend of sustainable growth, always going through a cycle of boom and bust. But it could be a good analogy, since out of the countries with encomiendas or haciendas were a thing, it's the wealthiest after Panama. Costa Rica being another good analogy, because out of the countries where they didn't have enough encomiendas or haciendas for them to have been a thing, they had the most. But the reason why it would be somewhere between Costa Rica and another country is because I find it really far-fetched that the Philippines would have no army in this timeline or get all of its energy from alternative sources like Costa Rica does. Chile and Uruguay could also be good analogies, since they had the least encomiendas or haciendas, and Panama could be another one, since even though it had the most haciendas and encomiendas out of the 5, it has the canal, which has helped them a lot. However, there is no canal in the Philippines, but it is close to the Strait of Malacca, which means that the logistics hub in Singapore could have been built in the Philippines. No doubt the descendants of those Chinese the Spanish killed in our timeline that they wouldn't have in this timeline for thinking they were collaborating with Britain during the 7 Years' War would be involved. Considering how much larger the Philippines would be and how much better its economy would be, the Philippines definitely wouldn't be a middle power like it is in our timeline. It would either be a regional or a great power.